When we talk about American history, we can often separate things by century, geography, or scale, but the deeper story is how patterns repeat across time. My focus today centers on the Navajo Nation and the 1979 Church Rock uranium spill, a disaster that released more radioactive material into the environment than the 3 Mile Island incident that occurred just 4 months earlier. Yet while 3 Mile Island became national news, Church Rock was ignored, its victims living on Navajo land, far from media attention and political protection. To understand why, we need to look beyond the spill itself and examine the long legacy of how indigenous communities have been treated in the United States. From the forced removal of the Muskogee Creek in Columbus, Georgia during the 1800s to the uranium extraction of the Navajo land in the 20th century. This pattern is unmistakable. Native Americans have repeatedly been marginalized, exploited for land and resources, and left to bear the consequences of decisions made without their consent. My argument is simple but critical. The Navajo people were undermined and afflicted by environmental racism and systemic neglect. And Church Rock reveals how indigenous lives have been historically devalued in comparison to white communities. When we compare the national outrage over 3 Mile Island with the near silence surrounding the Church Rock, the inequality becomes impossible to ignore. When we place Church Rock beside the Muskogee removal, we see the same logic of disposition, sacrifice, and disregard has echoed across centuries. This is not just a story about a spill. It's a story about power, memory, and whose suffering the nation chooses to see. To get started, to paint a picture, you have to start with the buildup that eventually resulted in the Church Rock uranium spill. World War II is underway. The U.S. is in a race to build a weapon unlike anything the world has ever seen. Scientists are scrambling in materials, and suddenly a metal that was once considered nothing more than a manning waste, uranium, becomes worth its weight in power. This moment marks the beginning of one of the most transformative and ultimately devastating shifts in the American Southwest. Government geologists start scanning the map, and their eyes land on the Colorado Plateau. It's rugged, it's remote, and much of it overlaps with Navajo land. Beneath this desert dirt lies one of the richest uranium deposits on Earth. Before the war, miners tossed uranium aside while pulling vanadium out of the ground, but once the Manhattan Project kicked into motion, that worthless waste became the key to nuclear weaponry. When the war ended, the demand didn't fade. It exploded. The Cold War took hold, and the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission became the sole buyer of uranium in the United States. They offered high prices, high rewards, and incentives that sparked a full-scale uranium boom through the late 1940s and the 1950s. Mining companies poured into the Navajo territory eager to cash in, and they recruited Navajo workers, men who needed jobs, men who trusted the government, and men who were never told about the prolonged exposure to radiation could kill them. For decades, miners dug, blasted beneath the radioactive dust with no warnings, no protections, just paycheck after paycheck labor and toxic industry they didn't know was slowly killing their bodies. And this is exactly what Judy Pasternak talks about in her book, Yellow Dirt. She talks about how this whole uranium extraction wasn't just a booming thing. It was unchecked. Regulation was weak, information was hidden, and Navajo workers were exposed to radiation without ever being told the risks. Mining wasn't just industry, it was intrusion. It was vulnerability without consent. Now hold that thought, because it leads us straight to Church Rock. Just outside the Navajo community sat a United Nuclear Corporation mill. Built despite known geological instability, it was part of the same pattern Pasternak documents. A hazardous facility dropped onto Navajo land because the government and industry assumed it could be. Poverty, isolation, and political underrepresentation made Navajo communities easy to overlook, and on July 16, 1979, just 34 years after the first atomic bomb was tested, the tailings dam failed. And in a single morning, more than 94 million gallons of radioactive waste surged into the Puerca River. Water was poisoned, sheep and cattle drank from it, children played near, entire communities were exposed, and the federal response? It was slow, it was minimal, it was dismissive. Just like Pasternak's narrative warns, the U.S. nuclear project prioritized weapons over indigenous lives. This disaster isn't an isolated event. It is a textbook example of environmental racism, exactly like the pattern described by Elinda M. Richards and On Poisoned Ground. Navajo land became a nuclear sacrifice zone. It was chosen because it lacked political power. It was given little regulation or transparency. It denied meaningful consent to land use, and the uranium mill was placed where it would never have been built on a wealthy, white community. Workers were never told about the radiation. Oversight was an afterthought. So when the dam bursted, the tragedy wasn't treated as national news. It was treated as background noise. That's the heart of Richard's argument. Marginalized communities are harmed, ignored, and left to live with the toxic aftermath. The Church Rock spill didn't end in 1979. Its contamination lingers in soil and water and memory. Church Rock, then, isn't just a disaster. Church Rock still matters today because the 1979 uranium mill disaster wasn't just another spill. It became the largest accidental release of radioactive material in U.S. history. And it didn't happen in a city, or near a military base, or anywhere with the power to demand accountability. It happened at Church Rock, on Native American land. And the radioactive waste flowed straight into the Puerco River, which was the lifeline for families, for livestock in the area, for everyday survival in a dry landscape. Imagine waking up to find your only water source glowing with poison. Federal officials didn't rush in. Cleanup wasn't immediate or thorough. National headlines barely blinked. While rivers in wealthier, wider regions might have caused outrage, congressional hearings, maybe even federal emergency teams, Church Rock was met with silence, a slow response, a shallow cleanup, and Navajo communities left to face contamination that would linger for decades. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the result of long-standing neglect. Sam Haywood, in Tragedy at Church Rock, makes it painfully clear. He traces the disaster back to years of ignored warnings, unstable infrastructure, and regulatory systems that failed to protect Navajo communities. The uranium mill was known to be risky. The dam showed signs of weakness long before it ruptured, yet nothing changed. No one acted. The people drinking from that river were never prioritized. Haywood reminds us that Church Rock exposes far more than the damaged dam. It exposed systemic inequality. It revealed how environmental risks were handled differently on Native American land, where oversight was weak, protection was minimal, and indigenous lives were treated as expendable in the pursuit of nuclear development. To understand why Church Rock still matters, we have to compare it to what happened just 4 months earlier. In March of 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident took place in Pennsylvania. It was a partial nuclear meltdown, serious, frightening, national headline news. The entirety of the country watched it unfold on television. Politicians spoke publicly, emergency teams were mobilized, investigations were launched immediately, founding and funding poured in, and most importantly, the surrounding population, which was mostly white, was prioritized and protected. Families were evacuated, health monitoring began, the government responded loudly, visibly, urgently. Now let's look at Church Rock. The same year, with an even bigger release of radioactive material, there's more toxic waste entering the environment, but this time it wasn't in Pennsylvania. It was on Navajo land. And instead of evacuations, medical screenings, or a sweeping federal investigation, Navajo families were told the river was safe within days. Livestock drank contaminated water, children bathed in it, community members washed clothes in it. No one came with bottled water, Geiger counters, or national media coverage. These were 2 disasters in the same nation, in the same year, with 2 very different responses. This is where environmental racism becomes impossible to ignore. The 3 Mile Island incident received national panic, policy reform, and immediately government intervention. Church Rock received silence. No mass evacuations, no major cleanup, no national outcry. The Navajo people were left to carry the weight on their own bodies, on their own land, and across generations. At Church Rock, the U.S. government and private industry could take risks where they would never been able to take to in white suburban community. They built a uranium mill on unstable ground, ignored warning signs, and failed to inform Navajo workers of radiation hazards. When the disaster hit, they walked away slowly, quietly, leaving Navajo people to bear the burden of contamination they never consented to. Meanwhile, 3 Mile Island became a national symbol of nuclear danger, while Church Rock was barely acknowledged, even though it was worse. And that's the difference. That's silence. That is the definition of environmental racism. Church Rock shows us who is protected and who is sacrificed, whose water matters and whose doesn't, whose health sparks national alarm, and whose suffering remains invisible. 3 Mile Island received resources, attention, and a legacy memorialized in public memory. Church Rock received a cleanup that was small, delayed, and incomplete. That's why this comparison matters. Because history reveals a truth that country rarely says aloud. When disaster struck white America, the nation responded. When disaster struck the Navajo Nation, the people were left to endure it alone. And here's the part that we can't ignore, because the story doesn't just end in 1979. More than 40 years have passed since radioactive waste poured into the Puerca River, yet countless Navajo families are still living in the consequences. Cancer rates remain high, kidney disease, respiratory illness, contaminated sheep, unsafe water sources, none of these belonging to the past. They are all present. They're daily, and they're inherited. Cleanup happened, yes, but only partially. Some areas were fenced off, others were tested, but never were restored. Radioactive tailings still sit in the soil. Children grow up on land where their great-grandparents once herded sheep, except now those same pastures carry a legacy of contamination. This is why Church Rock isn't just a historical footnote. It's a living wound. Church Rock has become a defining symbol of environmental injustice. An example of what happens when a community whose land worth mining, but not lives deemed worth protecting. This reality directly reinforces Sam Haywood's argument that disaster didn't just expose a broken dam, it exposed a broken system. Federal oversight failed, regulation failed, and the people who suffered most were the people with the least political power to resist. It revealed who has the privilege of safety and who is expected to endure sacrifice. Haywood's work makes it clear that indigenous communities like the Navajo weren't simply victims of an accident. They were targeted by a system that saw their land as valuable and their lives as expendable. Uranium fueled U.S. power, but the Navajo bore the fallout. They were left with cancers, the contaminated soil, the poisoned rivers, and the governmental response that never matched the scale of harm. And that's why Church Rock still matters today. Because the contamination remains. Because families are still sick. Because history isn't finished. Church Rock stands as a reminder and a warning of what environmental racism looks like in real time. But the saddest thing is when you can look back across centuries and you can see countless examples of this. I chose the Muskogee County as another example, the Muskogee Creek in specific. For my in-person research, I studied more of the historical Columbus, the Muskogee Creek, and I found a book called The Triumph of Ecunnau-Nuxulgee, it's a very complicated way to say, by William W. Winn. When we turn to William W. Winn's novel, the historical roots of this pattern become painfully clear. Winn documents how the Muskogee were systematically stripped of their homeland by land speculators of Columbus, Georgia, politicians and state leaders, most notably under Governor George Troup, who framed indigenous presence as an obstacle to economic progress. Creek territory, once thriving with farms, towns, and political leadership, became a target for expansion. Cotton produced and profit. Treaties supposedly designed to protect Creek land were instead manipulated. They were undermined or outright broken when they stood in the way of white settlement. The Creek removal was not unfortunate policy failure. It was engineered. And Winn makes it evident with his displacement was justified through the same logic that would later shape uranium mining in the Southwest. Indigenous land was viewed as something that can be extracted from, not protected. Indigenous people were seen as removable, disposable, and politically inexpendable. From cotton to uranium, the resource has changed. The logic does not. In the 19th century Southeast, Muskogee land became the foundation of America's agricultural wealth. In the 20th century, Southwest Navajo land became the foundation for America's nuclear arsenal and energy ambitions. 2 eras, 2 industries, 1 recurring pattern. The Muskogee removal in the 1800s, the Navajo uranium mining in Church Rock in 1979, land seized for cotton, plantations, expansion land target for uranium extractions, and milling, treaties broken. Rights ignored, environmental protections overlooked, safety standards were weak, forced displacements from ancestral homelands, forced to live among radioactive waste and contaminated water, violence and removal justified as progress, neglect justified as necessary for national defense. Just as Muskogee communities were pushed aside to make room for wealthier settlers, Navajo communities were placed in the danger for the nation so they could pursue technological and military power. And when disaster struck, when the Church Rock tailings dam failed, and radioactive sewage flooded into the Puerco River, the response mirrored the indifference that followed Muskogee removal. Little media attention, minimal aid, lives uprooted, health risked, futures altered. The tragedy is not these events happened, but that the United States allowed them to happen for the same reasons. Winn's work shows us that the creek removal was not merely a moment of injustice, but a blueprint. Remove indigenous people when valuing land, take what lies beneath, and justify it as progress. Church Rock reveals that blueprint survived into the nuclear age, 2 centuries apart, and yet land was taken, people were sacrificed, profit was prioritized over native well-being. The Muskogee lost their homeland, the Navajo kept theirs, but not safely. Both histories show us that colonization did not end with forced removal. It evolved, becoming environmental, industrial, and radioactive. Thank you. I used 4